My son, Frankie, squeezed my arm black and blue just for asking about my own money. He tried to starve me into submission, convinced he was just breaking a confused old man, but he forgot. The very watchmaker's hands he abused knew how to build the perfect machine for a reckoning, and his time was running out. Have you ever spent your entire life building something with your own two hands, something honest and steady, something you could count on, only to wake up one day and realize that the one person you trusted most in the world was trying to take it all apart piece by piece? Hello, everyone. My name is Harry Roberts. Thank you for being here, for listening to an old man's story. It means more than you know. If you don't mind, I'd love to hear what city you're all listening from. It's a good thing, to be reminded you're not alone. My Sundays, for as long as I can remember, have been governed by a certain ritual. It's a simple one, but it's mine. After church service, I'd come home to the quiet house, the air still smelling faintly of the coffee I'd made at dawn. I'd heat up whatever soup was left over from Saturday night, usually a simple chicken noodle or a hearty split pea. Nothing fancy. And then, at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I would settle into my lazy boy recliner. This wasn't just any chair. It was the one Martha, my late wife, bought me for my birthday the last Christmas she was with us. The leather is worn smooth in all the right places, and it sighs a little when I sit down, a familiar, comforting sound, almost like it remembers me. This chair is more than just a piece of furniture. It's a sanctuary. From this spot, I can hear the gentle, reassuring tick-tock of the clocks on the wall. The old grandfather clock that was my father's, the cuckoo clock we bought on a trip to Germany. Each one marks the passing of time in its own voice. And most importantly, from this chair, I could watch the Chicago Bears game. For those 3 hours, with the remote control resting on the armrest, I felt like a normal American man again. A man who still had some small claim over his own world, a man entitled to the simple pleasure of watching his team. It was my time. But that particular Sunday was different. I settled into the chair, the worn leather groaning its familiar welcome. I had just finished my soup, the warm bowl resting on the side table. The pre-game shows were probably already on, the commentators' voices building up the day's drama. I picked up the remote, aimed it at the dark screen, and pressed the power button. Nothing. The small red light on the television didn't even flicker. I pressed it again, harder this time, the way you do when you think a little force might solve the problem. Still nothing. The screen remained a black, silent void. I checked the batteries, even though I knew I'd just changed them. Finally, after a third press, the screen flickered to life, but not with the familiar logos and colors of the broadcast. A small white sentence appeared in the center of the darkness, written in a cold, sterile font. It looked like a line from a death certificate. Service has been disconnected. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. That couldn't be right. It was impossible. I have a good memory. A watchmaker has to. You can't work with gears and springs no bigger than a grain of sand if you're forgetful. And I remembered with perfect clarity giving my son Frankie $150 in cash just last week. It was for the cable and internet bill. I'd counted it out for him from my wallet, a 50, 420s, and 2 5s. I'd even made a note of it, right there in the little spiral notebook I keep on the end table. A man who spends his life with numbers doesn't forget them. Just then, Frankie shuffled into the room. He brought the stale, cheap smell of cigarettes with him, a smell that seemed to cling to the curtains and the carpet. I kept my voice even, calm. I didn't want to start an argument. That's not how we men of my generation were raised to handle things. "Frankie," I said, pointing the remote at the screen, "the TV isn't working." He glanced at the television, then at me, and he shrugged. Just a simple lift and drop of his shoulders. But that single, careless gesture somehow managed to shatter the peace of my entire Sunday afternoon. His eyes were drifting around the room, as if my problem, my one simple joy for the week, was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a fly buzzing in his ear. Something hot and tight coiled in my chest. It was the weak protest of an old man, I suppose. "No," I said, my voice a little firmer than I intended. "No, I'm sure of it. I wrote it down." I started to push myself up from the chair, my intention to grab the notebook from the table and show him the proof, the undeniable black and white entry. But before I could get to my feet, Frankie's hand was on my arm. It wasn't the hand of a son helping his father stand. It was a grip. Hard. His fingers, surprisingly strong, pressed into the thin skin of my forearm, digging in like a vice. He leaned in close, so close I could feel his breath on my cheek. He whispered, but the whisper carried the weight of a command. "Dad, just let it go. You're making things complicated." He released me just as quickly and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. The quiet was different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, oppressive, louder than any television broadcast. I sat there for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled up the sleeve of my plaid shirt. 5 red marks were blooming on my skin, already beginning to darken at the edges. My hand, the hand of a watchmaker. These hands had assembled movements with pieces so small you could barely see them. These hands had changed his diapers, had taught him how to grip a baseball, had built the model train set that sat in his closet for years. These hands had held my Martha's as she took her last breath. And now, on that same skin, was the imprint of the son I had raised. The bruise wasn't just on my arm. I could feel it forming somewhere deep inside me, a dark, cold place where dignity is supposed to live. The dull, throbbing ache in my arm finally pulled me from my thoughts. My eyes drifted across the room, landing on the wall opposite my chair. There, next to my grandfather's pendulum clock, were 2 small, empty hooks. For 40 years, those hooks had held 2 vintage Omega Constellation watches from the 1960s. They were my father's. He left them to me, and I was meant to leave them to my son. But they weren't there anymore. All that remained were 2 faint, ghost-like outlines on the wallpaper, a slightly paler shade of beige where the watches had protected it from the sun for decades. And in that hollow, silent moment, I finally understood. The TV wasn't the only thing that had been taken from me. My time, my family's time, it was being sold off, piece by stolen piece. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single minute. The ticking of the clocks, the sound that had been the steady, gentle rhythm of my life for so many years, the sound that had lulled me to sleep every night since Martha passed. It was different now. It had turned hostile. Each tick wasn't a measure of time passing. It was a countdown. Tick. Another second of my life gone. Tock. Another moment closer to what? I didn't know, and that was the most terrifying part. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to mock me with its deep, sonorous chime. A sound that once felt like the heartbeat of our home now felt like a judge's gavel. The next morning, I rose out of habit more than anything else. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale gray light through the windows. My body ached not from the strain of a long day's work, but from the deep, gnawing exhaustion that comes from a mind that won't shut down. I made my way to the kitchen, my feet shuffling on the cold linoleum. The first thing I did every morning was open the refrigerator to get out the milk for my coffee. It was an automatic, thoughtless gesture. But that morning, the gesture was met with a cold, glaring emptiness. I stood there, the refrigerator door wide open, a wave of chilly air washing over my bare feet. The small interior light illuminated a landscape of scarcity, a half-empty carton of milk, its expiration date looming, A single stick of butter in a chipped ceramic dish. 3 eggs sitting alone in a carton meant for a dozen. That was it. The vast white empty shelves seemed to stretch on forever. My mind flashed back instantly. It was 3 days ago. Frankie had come to me, saying he was heading to the grocery store. "I'll need about $100, Dad. Prices are crazy these days." He'd said it so casually. I gave him the money from my pension check, watching him tuck the crisp bills into his pocket. Looking at this barren refrigerator, I knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut. It had simply vanished, just like the cable service, just like the watches. I let the door swing shut and sat down heavily at the small kitchen table, the place where Martha and I used to share our morning coffee. A stack of mail sat by the salt shaker, where I always put it. My mail. Frankie was supposed to sort through it, pay what needed paying. I hadn't looked at it myself in months. He'd insisted on taking care of it. "Let me handle this stuff, Dad. You just relax." His words echoed in my mind now, dripping with a new, sinister meaning. My hands trembled slightly as I sifted through the envelopes. The first 2 were junk mail. The third was the water bill, marked past due. The fourth was the electric bill. It wasn't in an envelope. It was a single, stark sheet of paper, folded in half. Across the top, in aggressive red letters, were the words, "Final disconnection notice." The final date for payment was yesterday. My blood ran cold. So it wasn't just my football game that had been taken away. It was the light. It was the heat that would be needed as autumn bled into winter. It was the very warmth and safety of this house. Beneath that notice was another envelope, a credit card statement addressed to Frankie that he must have left there by mistake. I almost pushed it aside, feeling it wasn't my business. But something compelled me to look. My eyes scanned the page until they landed on the balance due. The number was printed in that same damning red ink. $40,000. $40,000. The figure seemed to scream from the page, a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. I felt a desperate need to escape, to go to the one place that was still truly mine. I pushed myself away from the table and made my way down the creaking wooden stairs to the basement. My workshop, my final refuge. The smell down here always calmed me, a mixture of old wood, lubricating oil, and metal. It was the smell of order, of precision, of purpose. But the moment I stepped onto the concrete floor, I knew something was wrong. The air was the same, but the space felt violated. My main toolbox, a heavy steel chest that I always kept meticulously organized and closed, was gaping open. Tools were out of place, some were missing entirely. A set of fine-tipped tweezers, a rare escapement file. Small things, but invaluable to my craft. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. And then I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. My professional jeweler's loupe, the powerful magnifying glass that was essentially my second set of eyes, was gone from its usual spot on the workbench. My gaze darted around the workshop, scanning the shelves. And there it was. It had been placed on the very top shelf, a dusty plank of wood near the ceiling beams. It was a place I could never reach, not with my stooped back and my unsteady legs. To get it, I'd need a stepladder, and even then, it would be a dangerous, precarious climb. That wasn't a careless act of tidying up. No, that was a statement. It was a message delivered with a quiet, calculated cruelty. He was taking away more than my money, more than my comforts. He was taking away my purpose. These hands, though wrinkled and sometimes stiff, still knew their way around the intricate world of a watch's movement. This mind, though he called it forgetful, could still diagnose a problem in a complex machine just by the sound it made. Placing my loupe out of reach was a form of punishment, a way of neutering me. It was a silent, devastating sentence. You are useless now. Your hobby, your passion, your life's work, it's all meaningless. My vision blurred. I sank onto my workbench stool, my eyes fixing on a faded photograph of Martha tacked to the wall. She was smiling, that beautiful, reassuring smile that had always been my anchor. "Harry," I could almost hear her whisper in my memory, "you promised me you'd take care of our boy." I did promise. On her deathbed, holding her hand, I promised. But I never imagined that taking care of him would mean letting him systematically destroy me. I reached out a trembling finger and traced the outline of her face. The photograph was faded, the colors softened by the years. Just like my promise, just like my authority as a father. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by my silent, disordered tools in the cold of the basement. The truth was no longer a vague suspicion, a flickering doubt in the back of my mind. It had become a physical thing. It had weight. And I was letting him. The cold in that basement was a physical thing, a damp, heavy presence that seemed to seep right through my clothes and into my bones. But it was nothing compared to the chill that was spreading through my soul. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cool cinder block wall, and the memories, unbidden, began to flood the darkness. Like ghosts summoned by the silence, they came one after another. I saw Frankie. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. We were outside a department store a few weeks before Christmas, the windows all decorated with fake snow and glittering lights. His face was pressed against the cold glass, his breath fogging a small circle right over the display. His eyes, wide with a child's pure, undiluted want, were locked on a remote-controlled race car, a beautiful, sleek red machine that cost more than I could reasonably afford. It was a tough year for the watch repair business. People were buying new, cheap watches instead of fixing the old, quality ones. Money was tight, so tight that Martha and I were reusing tea bags. But I saw the look in my son's eyes, that look of absolute wonder, and I made him a silent promise. For 3 nights in a row after closing the shop, I stayed late at my workbench, taking on the jobs no one else wanted. The rusted, forgotten pocket watches, the clocks with movements so damaged they seemed hopeless. My eyes burned under the loupe, my fingers ached from manipulating the tiny, stubborn parts. But all I could see was his face, and when he unwrapped that box on Christmas morning, his shriek of joy, it made every tired hour worth it. It felt like the purest form of fatherhood. The image dissolved, replaced by another. The college years. Martha had been gone for just over a year, and the grief was still a raw, open wound in our house. The silence she left behind was deafening. Then the letter came from the university bursar's office, a tuition hike, a significant one. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the numbers and feeling a familiar wave of panic. There was no question in my mind, not for a second. The next day, I went to the bank and withdrew the entirety of my retirement savings, the money Martha and I had so carefully put away for our old age, the nest egg that was supposed to be our security. I lived on peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for months. I wore my sweaters until the elbows wore thin. I did it all so he could graduate without the crushing weight of student loans, so he could start his life on a clean slate. I still have the first overdraft notice I ever received in my life from that time, tucked away in a file cabinet. For years, I looked at it not with shame, but with a strange sense of pride. It felt like a medal, a testament to a father's love, proof that I had done my duty. And then came the business opportunity, the big one. He was in his late 20s, full of fire and ambition. It was some kind of tech startup, something about an app. He tried to explain it to me once, using words like synergy and monetization that meant nothing to an old watchmaker. All I understood was that he needed $40,000. "This is it, Dad," he'd said, his eyes shining with that same intensity I'd seen in front of the toy store window all those years ago. "This is the big one. It's a sure thing." I hesitated. My gut, The intuition of an old craftsman who understands that anything built to last needs a solid foundation told me something was wrong. The plan felt flimsy, built on buzzwords instead of substance. But how does a father say no to his son's dream? How do you look your child in the eye and tell him you don't believe in him? I couldn't do it. So I went back to the bank. I remortgaged this house. The house Martha and I had poured our lives into. The house where every floorboard holds a memory. 6 months later, the business was bankrupt. The $40,000 had vanished into thin air. All he said was, "Sorry, Dad." And that was it. The subject was never brought up again. Where did all that sacrifice go? Sitting there in the cold, I asked the darkness that question. Did it curdle and turn into the bruises on my arm? Did it evaporate and leave behind an empty refrigerator? Did it transform into the cold, dismissive look in my son's eyes? I had given him pieces of my life one by one. Every saved dollar, every extra hour of work, the very roof over my head. And for what? For the sickening, gut-wrenching realization that to him, I wasn't a father to be respected. I was a resource. I was a bank account to be drained. And the balance was... The knuckles were swollen with arthritis, the skin thin and spotted. They were covered in the calluses and tiny, faded scars from a lifetime of working with sharp metal and delicate gears. These were the hands that had built a life, a family, a business. And these were the same hands that had signed the checks, that had withdrawn the savings, that had handed over the cash again and again, without question. I had always called it love. But sitting there, stripped of everything, I had to ask myself the hardest question of all. Was it love? Or was it just blindness? Frankie owed his creditors $40,000. It's a staggering amount of money. But as I sat there, shrouded in the darkness of his betrayal, I realized there was a much larger debt at play. A debt that could never be repaid with money. It was the debt of gratitude. The debt of respect. The debt of a son's love for his father. And as that profound, unbearable sadness reached its absolute bottom, something else began to stir in the depths of me. It wasn't despair anymore. It wasn't self-pity. It was rage. A rage as cold, as quiet, and as precise as the clicking of a watch movement. Hearing this, I believe many of us have made silent sacrifices for our children without ever asking for credit. Have you ever looked back and wondered if your giving was truly appreciated? Please, share your story in the comments below. It helps to know we are not alone. I don't know how long I sat there in the basement, adrift in a cold sea of memory. Hours, maybe. Time itself seemed to have broken, its familiar, steady rhythm lost to the crushing weight of the present. But then, a change. Through the thick, suffocating silence of my workshop, a familiar sound that had been my constant companion for over 30 years ceased. The old wind-up mantel clock on the corner shelf, my faithful timekeeper for testing repairs, gave one last weary tick and fell silent. Its brass pendulum, which had swung with the metronomic certainty of a heart, faltered a few times before coming to a complete final rest. The sudden absolute quiet was a physical blow, more shocking than any shout could have ever been. It was the sound of an ending. In that deafening stillness, a thought, clear and sharp as a shard of crystal, cut through the fog of my grief. If I did not find the key to win the mainspring of my own life, I would end up just like that clock, silent, motionless, a forgotten relic gathering dust in the darkness, my story ending not with a dignified chime, but with a pathetic, unheard whimper. Enough. The sadness had run its course. The confusion had gnawed at me long enough. Martha, my Martha, would never have wanted to see me like this. She would not have wanted the man she loved to simply run out of time. I'm not a fighter. I haven't been in a real fight since the schoolyard, all scraped knuckles and foolish, boyish pride. My weapons have never been my fists. They are my eyes, my steady hands. My weapons are precision, patience. My most powerful tool is the ability to see the smallest, most insignificant detail that everyone else overlooks. You cannot defeat a complex machine with brute force. You'll only shatter the gears and bend the escape wheel. No, a complex movement must be dismantled systematically, piece by piece, gear by gear, screw by tiny hidden screw. Frankie had built a machine of lies and deceit, a sophisticated self-winding complication designed to drain my life away. And I, the man who taught him his first numbers on a clock face, would be the one to patiently, meticulously take it apart. With a groan that seemed to rise from the very floor, I pushed myself to my feet. Every joint protested, a chorus of clicks and creaks echoing in the new silence. My eyes flickered up to the high shelf where my jeweler's loupe sat, a hostage in its own home, mocking my physical limitations. Not yet, I thought. That tool was for the final, intricate work of reassembly. For now, I needed the tools of deconstruction. I shuffled over to my main workbench and slid my hand underneath to the place no one else knew. My fingers found the small, hidden latch I'd built into the frame decades ago. A secret drawer, perfectly flush with the apron, slid open with the soft whisper of well-oiled wood on wood. Inside lay two objects, nestled on a bed of faded velvet. The first was an old leather-bound ledger, the kind I used only for my most important clients, a logbook for the painstaking restoration of rare, priceless timepieces. Its paper was thick, archival grade, meant to outlast the man writing on its pages. Beside it, its black resin body was cool and solid in my hand. Its handcrafted gold nib still as perfect as the day she'd given it to me. I took them out, feeling their familiar, comforting weight. These would be my first tools. This would be my new restoration project, the restoration of my own life. I carried them upstairs to the kitchen table. The weak morning light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, chaotic gears. I opened the ledger to the first pristine, empty page. The smooth, clean slate felt like a declaration of intent. I uncapped the pen, the faint, pleasant smell of ink reaching me. I took a deep, steadying breath, and then I began to write. The only sound in the entire house was the delicate, deliberate scratch of the gold nib moving across the textured paper. To an outsider, it would have been a quiet, peaceful sound. But to me, it was the roar of cannons. It was the crack of a rifle. It was the first shot fired in a war I didn't ask for, but now, by God, I intended to win. I didn't write about my feelings. Feelings could be dismissed. I wrote facts. The first line, August 26th, cable TV bill, $150. Given to F in cash, service disconnected. The second line, bruise, upper right arm, caused by F gripping my arm forcefully. I documented the missing Omega watches, the empty refrigerator, the $100 for groceries that never appeared. I wrote down the final disconnection notice for the electricity. The $40,000 credit card debt in his name, everything. Memory, I knew, is a tricky, unreliable mechanism. It can be twisted, questioned, and dismissed as the ramblings of a forgetful old man. But ink on paper is evidence. It is a gear that cannot be denied. When I finished the first page, a feeling I hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime surfaced from the depths of my despair. Hunger. A real, sharp, demanding hunger. Not the dull, empty ache of being neglected, but the clean, honest hunger of a man who has just completed a difficult and vital task. I walked to the refrigerator and took out the last 2 eggs. I cracked them into a hot pan, the sizzle a satisfying, defiant sound in the quiet kitchen. I cooked them carefully, seasoning them with a pinch of salt and pepper, and slid them onto a plate. I sat at the table and ate slowly, deliberately, chewing every bite. This was not the meal of a victim. This was the meal of a soldier before a long march. It was rations. It was fuel for the fight to come. Frankie came home around noon, whistling some tuneless pop song. He didn't find a broken old man slumped in his recliner, waiting for the world to end. He found me sitting at the kitchen table, reading the Wall Street Journal through my spectacles, just like any other day. He didn't know about the ledger, now safely hidden back in its secret drawer. He didn't know about the cold, steel-like resolve that had replaced the grief in my heart. I looked up from my paper as he walked past to grab a beer from the still empty refrigerator. I nodded at him. A simple, placid nod of acknowledgement. The war had begun, but it would be fought on my terms, silently, precisely, and with absolutely no mercy. The fragile calm I had manufactured for myself lasted only as long as Frankie was in the house. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, the quiet tension returned, coiling in my stomach. My plan, my silent war, couldn't be fought with just a ledger and a pen. I needed more than my own memories. I needed facts that existed outside of my own head. I needed validation. Frankie controlled my smartphone, a sleek, complicated device I never fully understood. He'd set it up for me, ostensibly to help manage the scam calls, as he put it. What it really meant was that he was the gatekeeper to my world. He saw every call, every text, but he didn't know everything. In a dusty box on a low shelf in my workshop, beneath a pile of old schematics, I kept a relic from another time, an old flip phone, a simple, honest machine built for one purpose, to make and receive calls. I'd kept it for emergencies. This, I decided, was an emergency. I retrieved it, its plastic body feeling solid and dependable in my hand. I plugged it in, and after a moment, the small screen flickered to life with a comforting green glow. As the battery charged, I thought about who I could call. It had to be someone who would believe me without. He was loud and opinionated, but his integrity was as solid as the granite he used to build his back patio. George didn't believe in excuses. He believed in evidence. Once the phone was charged, I waited. I sat in the basement, listening to the house settle around me, every creak of the floorboards above making me jump. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across my workbench. Finally, I heard Frankie's car in the driveway, the slam of his door, the sound of the TV switching on in the living room. I gave him an hour, letting him get settled into his world of noise and distraction. Then, heart pounding, I closed the basement door as quietly as I could, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the silence. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped open the phone and dialed George's number from memory. It felt illicit, like I was a teenager making a secret call from his parents' basement, a criminal in my own home, my own sanctuary. He picked up on the third ring. Petrocelli. His voice was a familiar gravelly bark. "George," I said, my own voice coming out as a dry, raspy whisper. I had to clear my throat. "George, it's me. It's Harry." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Harry, my God, man, where have you been? We were about to send out a search party. Your boy said you were under the weather, not feeling up to visitors." The lie, so casually delivered, stung me even through the phone. "George," I interrupted, my voice gaining a desperate edge. "I need your help. It's important." The tone in my voice must have been enough. George's demeanor shifted instantly from friendly concern to focused attention. "What is it, Harry? What's wrong?" I told him about the watches, the two 1960s Omega Constellations, my father's legacy. I described them in the loving detail only a watchmaker could, but I didn't rely on just my description. I opened my old ledger, the one I'd used for decades, to document every significant piece that had ever crossed my bench, and I read him the serial numbers I'd inscribed there 30 years ago. George, I know this is a big ask, but could you check? Discreetly. On the forums, the auction sites, see if anyone's trying to sell them. I heard George take a long, slow breath on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man processing a very ugly possibility. I'm on it, Harry, he said, his voice now low and serious. Don't you worry. Stay on the line. A moment later, I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of his computer keyboard. The sound of a search being launched into the digital world where secrets go to be sold. The next 5 minutes were among the longest of my life. I stood there in the dark, the cold phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence and the distant muffled sound of the TV upstairs. I imagined the bits and bytes flying through the ether, searching for a piece of my family's history, for a piece of my stolen life. Then, George's voice came back on the line, but the warmth was gone. It was replaced by a cold, controlled fury. I found them, Harry. My heart seized in my chest. Found them? Yeah, he bit out the word. On an auction forum. They're already sold. The auction closed 2 weeks ago. The basement suddenly felt airless. I leaned against the workbench for support. Who was the seller? I asked, even though a terrible certainty was already cementing itself in my gut. George was silent for a second. When he spoke again, his voice was laced with pure venom. The seller's username was Frankie R88. The final sale price was $5,000 for both. Harry, that's less than half their value. The son of a bitch. He sold your family's history for pennies on the dollar. Hearing it confirmed by an outsider, by a trusted friend, made it real in a way my own suspicions never could. The pain was sharp, a physical blow. But strangely, beneath the pain, there was something else, a sliver of relief. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't losing my mind. This was real. George, thank you, I whispered into the phone. Don't you thank me, Harry. George's voice was hard as iron. You listen to me. I've saved everything. The whole damn webpage, screenshots of the auction, the seller's name, the buyer's details, the final price, all of it. And more importantly, I now had my first piece of irrefutable, undeniable proof. I walked over to the secret drawer, took out my leather ledger and the Mont Blanc pen. Beneath my meticulous notes on the unpaid bills and the bruises, I switched to a different color of ink, a deep, resolute blue. I wrote a new line, my handwriting steady and clear. Evidence 1, confirmed sale of 2 Omega watches. Witness, George Petrocelli, digital records secured. The first seed had been planted. Now it was time to let it grow. On Friday night, an opportunity presented itself. Frankie came into the living room, jangling his car keys. Going out with some friends, he announced, not really to me, but to the room in general. Don't wait up. He said it with the casual, magnanimous air of a man granting a great favor. The moment I heard the engine of his beat-up sedan fade down the street, a profound silence fell over the house. And in that silence, I knew. This was my chance. It might be the only one I would ever get. My ledger was filled with suspicions and one piece of digital proof from a friend. Now I needed something tangible. I needed to get into his room. I was certain that behind that door lay the answers to the question that had been haunting me. Where had my money, my life, gone? Standing before his bedroom door felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. My hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, rested on the cold brass of the doorknob. I hadn't set foot in this room since he moved back in months ago. It was his space, his territory, and I was from a generation that believed a man's room was his castle. But respect, I realized, is a two-way street, and the bridge of respect between us had been burned to the ground. That trust was dead, and I was now simply a detective investigating its murder. With a grim finality, I turned the knob. It wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. It was the arrogance of a man who is so certain of his power, so dismissive of the old man down the hall, that he doesn't even consider the possibility of being challenged. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic drumming in my chest, I pushed the door open and stepped into the enemy's territory. The room hit me first as a smell, a stale, sour cocktail of old cigarette smoke, unwashed laundry, and something vaguely sweet and chemical. It was the scent of neglect. Clothes were strewn everywhere, on the floor, draped over a chair. A pyramid of empty beer cans stood precariously on a nightstand. It was the chaotic den of a stranger, not the clean, orderly room of the boy I had raised. This was the landscape of a life spiraling out of control. I began to search, my movements guided by the systematic precision of my trade. I started with the obvious places. Under the bed, I found only dust and a stray sock. In the closet, a chaotic tangle of shirts and jackets that smelled even more strongly of smoke. Nothing. Just the debris of a life lived without care or consequence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, unsynchronized ticking. Every sound from outside, the groan of the pipes, the distant wail of a siren, made me flinch, my muscles tensing for a fight I couldn't possibly win. And then I saw it. On a cluttered desk in the corner, his laptop was open, its screen casting a lurid, colorful glow in the dim room. It was still logged in. The screen was filled with the flashing lights, spinning wheels, and cryptic charts of an online gambling website. I didn't know the password to his computer, but I didn't need it. The screen told me enough, but it was what lay next to the laptop that made my blood run cold. A messy stack of papers, held down by a half-empty coffee mug, credit card bills, a notice from a pawn shop, and a thick sheaf of folded documents, bank statements. My hand trembled as I carefully lifted the coffee mug and picked them up. The name at the top of the page was my own, Harry Coleman, my address. But the transactions listed below were a language from a foreign land, a steady, relentless hemorrhage of my life savings. A series of small cash withdrawals, $200 here, $300 there, made almost every single day from an ATM across town. Transfers to websites with names like Vegas Palace and Lucky Bets. And then, halfway down the page of the most recent statement, I found it. A single, large deposit. $5,000. The date of the transaction matched the exact day George had told me the cold, hard, undeniable proof, printed in black and white. My first instinct was to take the whole stack and run, but I knew he'd notice they were gone instantly. My silent war would be over before it had truly begun. I needed the evidence, but I couldn't take the source. My eyes darted around the room, landing on the old flip phone I'd tucked into my shirt pocket. I pulled it out, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. As quickly and as quietly as I could, I began to photograph each page. In the suffocating silence of the room, the small electronic click of the phone's camera sounded like a bomb detonating. I held my breath with each snap, trying to keep my shaking hands steady, praying the images would be clear enough to read. 1 page, 2, 3. The deposits, the withdrawals, the payments to Vinny. Click, click, click. After photographing the last page, I took a moment to compose myself, my breath coming in ragged gasps. With the deliberate care of a watchmaker reassembling a delicate movement, I put the papers back exactly as I had found them, placing the coffee mug on top in precisely the same spot. I scanned the room one last time, ensuring I had left no trace of my intrusion. Then I backed out of the room, pulling the door closed until I heard the softest possible click of the latch. My heart was still pounding like a hammer against an anvil. I had what I needed. Now I just had to get away with it. Back in the sanctuary of my basement, I slid the bolt on the door and leaned my full weight against the solid wood, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My legs felt weak, my hands still buzzed with adrenaline. But as the frantic hammering in my chest began to subside, a strange and unfamiliar feeling washed over me. The panic was gone. The heart-stopping fear of discovery was gone. In its place was a profound and icy calm. It was the same stillness I felt after hours of painstaking work. At the exact moment I managed to fit the final microscopic gear into a complex watch movement, the tumblers of the universe had clicked into place. The full picture, once a chaotic mess of suspicions and grief, was now perfectly, horrifyingly clear. Doubt had evaporated. All that remained was the hard, ugly truth, captured in a series of blurry photographs on the screen of an old, cheap phone. I sat down at my workbench, my own territory, and began the meticulous process of securing my victory. I plugged the flip phone into my old desktop computer, a machine I kept offline, isolated from the world. With steady hands, I carefully transferred each photograph from the phone's tiny memory card to a small, nondescript USB drive. A backup. You always make a backup. It's the first rule of any craftsman who deals with things that are irreplaceable. As the small green progress bar crept across the screen, I watched the images load one by one. This wasn't just data being transferred. This was my life being quantified. It was the $20,000 drained from my account in just over 3 months. It was the name of the pawn shop that had fenced my father's watches. It was the address of the online casinos that had consumed my retirement savings. It was the irrefutable evidence that my lifetime of sacrifice had been cashed in for cheap thrills and losing bets. When the last file finished transferring, I ejected the drive and held it in the palm of my hand. It was a tiny, weightless piece of black plastic, insignificant. Yet to me in that moment it felt as heavy as a blacksmith's hammer. It was a tool, and a tool could be used for 2 things, to build or to break. I had spent my entire life building a family, building a business, building a legacy of honesty and hard work, one tiny, precise movement at a time. I had never wanted to break anything. But Frankie hadn't left me a choice. Sometimes I thought, to save the structure of a house, you first have to tear out the parts that are rotten to the core. Around midnight, I heard him come home. The clumsy fumbling of keys at the door, the heavy, drunken footsteps stumbling through the hall. I was upstairs now, sitting in my lazy boy, the television screen dark and silent in front of me. I closed my eyes and let my head loll to the side, feigning sleep. He shuffled past me, reeking of stale beer and cheap cologne, muttering something incoherent under his breath before disappearing into his room and slamming the door. He never gave me a second glance. In his world, I was no longer a person. I was just part of the furniture. A harmless, half-senile old man. He had mistaken silence for surrender. I waited until the sounds from his room had been replaced by the low, guttural rumble of snoring. Only then did I allow myself to move. I went back down to the basement, to my secret drawer, and retrieved the leather ledger. Next to the entry from George, I uncapped my Mont Blanc. I dipped the nib into the bottle of Resolute blue ink. With the same precision I would use to inscribe a name on the back of a watch case, I wrote, Evidence 2, bank statements, photographic copies secured, details, unauthorized cash withdrawals totaling 21,050 between June 1st and August 29th, transfers to multiple online gambling sites, single deposit of $5,000 on August 15th. I listed every damning detail, every date, every amount, every unfamiliar payee. There was no emotion in my handwriting, no anger, no sadness. It was the cold, clean, mechanical recording of fact, the truth, stripped of all the pain that came with it. I placed the ledger and the small, heavy USB drive back into their secret compartment. Everything was in its place. The machine was assembled. The evidence was secured. The witness was ready. But I knew, as I sat there in the quiet hum of the old house, that I was missing one crucial component. I was missing a plan to bring this all to light. I was a watchmaker, not a lawyer. I knew how to assemble the evidence, but I didn't know how to present it in a way that would matter. I couldn't confront Frankie myself. That would be a battle of his brute force against my tired bones. I needed an expert. I needed someone who knew how to wield a hammer like the one I now possessed. I didn't know who that person was yet. But as I finally climbed the stairs to my own bed, the first glimmer of dawn breaking through the kitchen window, I knew I would find them. The storm was coming, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I was no longer afraid. I was the one holding the lightning. The next few days passed in a strange, silent truce. We moved around each other like two wrestlers circling the mat, each aware of the other's presence, each waiting for the other to make a move. I maintained my facade of harmlessness, reading the paper at the kitchen table, dozing in my chair. But underneath, I was anything but calm. The secret knowledge I held, locked away in the drawer downstairs, was a source of constant nervous energy. I felt like a man carrying a live wire in his pocket. The power was mine, for now, but I had no idea how to connect it to anything that could make a difference. I was an army of one, with a full arsenal, but no battlefield. The Cold War broke on a Tuesday morning. Frankie came into the living room while I was reading, not with a request, but with a demand. He tossed a thick, official-looking envelope onto the ottoman in front of me. "Dad, I need you to sign these," he said, his tone casual, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "It's just some paperwork to make it easier for me to manage your finances. Pay your bills, deal with the bank, save you the hassle." I picked up the sheaf of papers. They felt heavy, important. The language was dense with legal jargon I couldn't fully comprehend, a deliberate wall of words designed to confuse and intimidate. But my eyes, trained to find the smallest detail on a watch face, scanned the pages until they found the two words I was looking for. The two words I had been dreading. Power of attorney. I knew what it meant. It wasn't about making things easier. It was the final move, the checkmate. It was the legal key to everything I had left in the world, the $85,000 in my retirement account, the last remnant of a lifetime of work. And this house, the home Martha and I had poured our souls into. He wasn't asking for a loan anymore. He was asking for the deed to my entire existence. A week ago, I might have signed it. Out of fear, out of sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. I might have just given in, letting the tide pull me under for good. But not now. I could almost feel the phantom warmth of the USB drive and the leather ledger in my secret drawer, radiating strength up through the floorboards. I slowly folded the papers and placed them back on the ottoman. I looked up, meeting his impatient gaze directly. "No," I said. The word was not loud. It was quiet, but it was solid. It was the heaviest thing in the room. "I need to read these more carefully. I'll have my lawyer take a look at them." I didn't have a lawyer. I hadn't spoken to a lawyer in 15 years, not since we'd drawn up our wills. But the words felt right. The predator, denied its prey, was showing its teeth. "Lawyer?" he scoffed, a nasty, brutish sound. "What lawyer? You don't have the money for a lawyer? Don't play games with me, old man." He snatched the papers off the ottoman. "Fine, don't sign." And in a sudden, violent movement fueled by rage, he shoved me, hard. It wasn't a casual push. It was a deliberate, forceful act. My shoulder recoiled, and my back, fragile and unready, slammed against the hard wooden arm of the lazy boy. A white-hot, blinding pain shot through my chest. It felt like a knife. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a terrifying second I couldn't breathe at all. It was my old rib injury, a hairline fracture from a fall a few years back. He had hit the exact spot. Frankie stormed out, slamming his bedroom door behind him, leaving me alone in the sudden, ringing silence. I sat there, paralyzed, gasping for air, the pain in my chest a pulsating, evil thing. And I knew this was it. This was the line in the sand, the financial abuse, the emotional manipulation, the gaslighting. I had absorbed all of it. I had endured it. But this was different. This was physical violence, a direct, intentional act to intimidate and harm me. He was willing to hurt me, to physically injure me, to get what he wanted. The fear, which had receded into a manageable hum, came roaring back. But this time, it had a different texture. It wasn't the paralyzing fear of a victim. It was the sharp, clarifying fear of a man whose life is in immediate danger. It was a catalyst. I had to get help. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, right now. My mind, scrambling for a lifeline, latched onto a memory. Sarah, the visiting nurse who came once a month to check my blood pressure and listen to my lungs. She was a kind, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with gentle hands and eyes that saw more than you wanted them to. I remembered her last visit, just a few weeks ago. She'd been checking my arm when her fingers brushed against the faint, yellowing remnants of the bruise Frankie had left. "Did you have a fall, Mr. Roberts?" she'd asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes sharp with a professional suspicion. I'd mumbled something about bumping into a doorframe, and I saw in her expression that she didn't believe me for a second. Before she left that day, she'd scribbled a number on the back of her card. "This is my personal cell," she'd said, looking me right in the eye. "If there's ever an emergency, you call me directly." This was an emergency. Biting back a groan, I pushed myself out of the chair, every movement sending a fresh wave of agony through my side. I shuffled, bent and broken, to the basement door. The trip down the stairs was a slow, torturous descent. My only thought was the flip phone, my lifeline. I found it in the box and dialed Sarah's number, my fingers clumsy with pain and urgency. She answered on the second ring. "Nurse Sarah speaking." Her voice was professional, calm, the voice of a person in control. I took a ragged breath. "Sarah, it's Harry Roberts." My own voice was a trembling wreck, broken not just by the pain, but by the sheer, far-whelming weight of finally breaking the silence. I need help." The words were out. They were real. I wanted to tell her he'd pushed me. I wanted to tell her my chest was on fire. But the shame was a gag in my throat. I couldn't say the words. A son doesn't do that. A father doesn't admit that. So instead, I gave her the truth I could bear to speak, the truth that was just as real. "He sold my watches," I rasped, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He's taking all the money from my bank account. Sarah, please. He's taking everything." On the other end of the line, there was no panic, no frantic questions. Sarah was simply quiet. It was the focused, attentive silence of an experienced professional, the kind of silence that creates space, that allows the broken, jumbled pieces of a story to be laid out on the table without judgment. She didn't interrupt my rambling, halting confession. She just listened, letting my story spill out in a torrent of shame and pain. When I finally trailed off, my throat raw, the silence stretched for a moment longer. I braced myself for the inevitable questions, the gentle doubt. "Are you sure, Mr. Roberts? Perhaps you misunderstood, but that wasn't what she said. What she said next was a balm on a wound I didn't even know was bleeding. "Mr. Roberts, Harry," she said, her voice calm and steady, an anchor in my storm. "I believe you, and thank you. Thank you for having the courage to call me." No one had looked past the gray hair and the wrinkled skin and seen a man who was still lucid, still capable of telling the truth. In that moment, The validation I received from this relative stranger was more powerful than any medicine. Then she began to speak again, and I realized with a dawning sense of shock that she had been a silent witness for months, long before I had even admitted the truth to myself. "Harry, do you remember a few weeks ago when I asked about the bruise on your arm? I've noticed other things too. I've noticed you've lost weight since I started visiting. I've noticed your pain medication prescriptions are always refilled sooner than they should be. And I've seen the way you hold yourself, the way you flinch almost, whenever your son is in the room." She took a breath, and her next words gave a name, a terrible and official weight to the private hell I'd been living in. "Harry, what you're describing, what I've been observing, it has a name. It's called elder abuse." To hear those words, spoken so plainly by a medical professional, was like a lightning strike. It lifted the suffocating blanket of shame that had been smothering me. This wasn't just my family's secret tragedy anymore. This wasn't my personal failure as a father. This was a recognized clinical condition. It was real. The realization was both devastating and liberating. "Harry, based on what you've told me, and on my own documented observations, I have a legal and ethical obligation to report this," Sarah explained, her tone shifting from empathetic listener to clear-eyed professional. "I'm going to make a call to Adult Protective Services. They are the government agency that investigates cases just like this. They will assign a caseworker, an investigator, to speak with you. I need your permission to do that. Are you okay with me making that call?" A part of me, the part that had been conditioned to fear and to avoid conflict at all costs, wanted to scream, "No!" The idea of strangers, government officials, coming into my home, peeling back the layers of my life was terrifying. It could make Frankie even angrier. It could make things 100 times worse. But another part of me, the watchmaker's rational mind, knew this was the only logical next step. I had taken this as far as I could on my own. I had assembled the parts, but I didn't have the power to make the machine run. I needed a stronger hand. I needed a force greater than my own. "Yes," I said, and the word came out stronger than I expected. Solid. Resolute. "Yes, I am. Please, please help me." I could almost hear the relief in her voice. "They will be very discreet, Harry," she reassured me. "They won't show up with sirens blazing. The investigator will likely come under the guise of a routine wellness check from a social worker. Your job now is to try to stay safe. Do not confront your son. Do not let him know you made this call. Let the system do its work. You've already done the hardest, most courageous part. You spoke up." After we hung up, I remained in the basement for a long time, the old flip phone still clutched in my hand. The sharp, stabbing pain in my ribs was still there, a brutal reminder of what had happened. But the crushing weight on my soul, the burden I had been carrying alone for so long, had lessened. It felt lighter. By calling Sarah, I had done more than just ask for help. I had struck a match in the darkness. I didn't know how big the fire would be. I didn't know what it would burn or what would be left when the smoke cleared. But as I sat there in the quiet solitude of my workshop, I knew one thing for certain. The flame was no longer burning alone. Someone else had seen it. And soon, very soon, others would see it too. 2 days later, the knock came. It wasn't the hurried rap of a delivery driver or the familiar tap of a neighbor. This was a formal, deliberate sound. 2 solid, authoritative knocks on the front door that seemed to echo through the entire house. Frankie, who was in the kitchen getting a beer, went to answer it. I sat frozen in my lazy boy, my newspaper trembling in my hands. I heard a woman's voice, polite but firm. carrying a weight of officialdom. "Good morning, sir." The sullen, resentful man I lived with vanished, and in his place stood a model of filial devotion. He became the son every parent dreams of, caring, concerned, and utterly overwhelmed with worry. "Oh, thank God you're here," Frankie said, his voice thick with a manufactured relief that was utterly convincing. He actually managed to make it sound like he was on the verge of tears. "I've been so worried about my father. He just hasn't been himself lately. Please, come in, come in." He ushered the woman into our living room. She was in her 50s, dressed in a simple but professional pantsuit, with an unreadable expression and observant eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Frankie guided her in, then turned to me, his face a perfect mask of loving concern. "Dad," he said, his voice soft and gentle, "we have a visitor. This is Mrs. Davis. She's here to talk." It was a masterpiece of deception. As Mrs. Davis sat down on the sofa opposite me, Frankie began his counterattack. It was cunning. It was insidious. He didn't attack me directly. He didn't raise his voice or call me names. He attacked my mind. "My dad has obsessions," he began, shaking his head with a profound, sorrowful sigh. He looked at Mrs. Davis with the earnest eyes of a man burdened by a terrible secret. "He spends money we don't have on these old broken-down watches. He'll buy them online, hide them, and then he forgets. He forgets he bought them, forgets where he put the money, and then he gets paranoid. He thinks someone is stealing from him. He thinks I'm stealing from him." He let that hang in the air for a moment, letting the poison sink in. "It's gotten to the point where he'll give me cash to hold for him because he's afraid he'll just spend it all. He makes me promise not to let him have it back. I'm just trying to protect him from himself, ma'am. That's all I've ever tried to do." Every word was a perfectly aimed dagger. He had taken my life's passion, my craft, and twisted it into a symptom of senility. He had taken his systematic theft and reframed it as a heroic act of protection. I sat there, stunned into absolute silence. My mouth was dry. What could I possibly say? My ledger? My USB drive? My carefully collected evidence? It all suddenly felt useless. If I started talking about bank statements and sold watches, wouldn't it just confirm his story? Wouldn't I just be the confused, paranoid old man he was describing? He had built the perfect trap, and I had walked right into it. He was weaponizing my age, my grief, my very identity against me. Mrs. Davis turned her calm, assessing gaze on me. The silence in the room was heavy, expectant. "Mr. Roberts?" she said, her voice even. "Is there anything you'd like to say in response to this?" I opened my mouth, but before any sound could come out, Frankie jumped in, his timing impeccable. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that looked protective but felt like a vice. "He gets very agitated," he said to Mrs. Davis, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's ashamed. He doesn't like people to see him like this. It's why he doesn't see his friends anymore. I had to call his buddies from the watch club and, well, I had to tell them he wasn't up for visitors. I was just trying to preserve his dignity, you know?" It was a brilliant, cruel move. He had just admitted to isolating me from the only friends I had left, but he'd managed to make it sound like an act of profound love. He was painting a picture of a man in cognitive decline, a man so lost that his loving son had no choice but to build a protective wall around him, a prison disguised as a sanctuary. All I could do was shake my head, a weak, pathetic gesture of defiance. That's not true," I whispered, but the words had no force. They were lost in the air, swallowed by the much more compelling, much more tragic story that Frankie was weaving. Mrs. Davis made a note in the small pad she held in her lap. Her face was a blank slate. Was there a flicker of pity in her eyes, or was it skepticism? I couldn't tell. And that was the most terrifying part. Who would she believe? The articulate, charming, seemingly devoted son who presented a logical, if heartbreaking explanation for everything? Or the tired, frail old man in the corner who could barely speak, who looked exactly like the part Frankie had cast him in? The seed of doubt had been planted, not in my mind, but in the mind of the one person who had the power to help me. And as I sat there, pinned to my chair by the weight of my son's lies, hope, which had felt so real and tangible just that morning, had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. The seed of doubt hadn't just been planted in the investigator's mind, it had been planted in my own. What if Frankie was right? Not about the stealing, but about me. What if I was just a confused old man, misremembering everything, twisting reality to fit some paranoid narrative? The line between his lies and my truth had been blurred by his masterful performance. He had won. I sat in the darkness of the living room, feeling the full, crushing weight of my defeat. It was then that the old flip phone, tucked away in my basement workshop, began to vibrate. For a moment, I considered not answering it. My entire body felt like lead. But the persistent buzzing was a call from a world I thought I'd lost. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of my energy, I made my way downstairs. The screen glowed with a familiar name, George. My heart sank even further. Frankie had told Mrs. Davis he'd called my friends. This must be the follow-up. George calling to offer his condolences, his gentle pity for the old friend who had finally lost his mind. I braced myself for the humiliation and answered the phone, my voice a hollow whisper. "Hello, George." But the voice that came roaring through the speaker was not filled with pity. It was a thunderclap of pure, unadulterated rage. "Harry, I just got off the phone with that goddamn son of yours," he bellowed, and I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "He gave me some sob story about how you've gone around the bend, spending all your money on worthless junk," he called it. "Confused? You? The man who can recall the serial number of a 1952 Patek Philippe he saw once 20 years ago? The man who can diagnose a faulty escapement by the sound it makes? Who the hell does that kid think we are? A bunch of damn fools?" I stood there, stunned, leaning against my workbench for support. The sheer force of his loyalty, the absolute, unquestioning belief in his voice, was a physical blow. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in my eyes and spilled down my cheeks. He believed me. Without a single moment of hesitation, he believed me. He said he was trying to protect me. I managed to choke out, the words thick with emotion. George let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of pure contempt. "Protect you? We had a saying in the Marines, Harry. Actions speak louder than words. And his actions were to sell your father's legacy on the internet for a fraction of its worth. That ain't protection. That's grave robbing, plain and simple." He wasn't finished. I could hear him pacing on the other end of the line, his anger fueling him. "This club of ours, Harry, he doesn't get it. He never will. He thinks it's just a bunch of old guys talking about shiny trinkets. It's not about the damn watches. It's about history. It's about honoring the craftsmanship. It's about preserving the things that were built to last in a world that throws everything away. Your son looks at a vintage Omega Speedmaster and sees a few $1,000. We look at it and see the hands of the men who built it. We see the astronauts who wore it to the moon. We see a story. When he insults you, your mind and your passion, he's insulting every single one of us." I could barely breathe. Each word he spoke was like a brick being laid, rebuilding the foundation of my identity that Frankie had tried so hard to demolish. "Now you listen to me, Harry." George's voice grew even more intense, a field commander issuing orders. After I hung up with that punk, I made a few other calls. I called Bill, I called Sam, I called everybody in the inner circle. They all said the same thing. Nobody, and I mean nobody, believes a word that kid says. We are all prepared to go on the record. We will tell that social worker, a judge, the President of the United States if we have to, that you are one of the sharpest, most honorable, and most lucid experts we have ever had the privilege of knowing. You are not alone in this fight. Do you hear me, old friend? We've got your back. I slid down onto my workshop stool, the phone pressed hard against my ear, letting his words wash over me. I couldn't speak. I could only weep, tears not of sadness or despair, but of overwhelming, profound gratitude. Frankie had tried to build a wall around me, to cut me off from the world and leave me to rot. But he had no idea that the friendships I'd forged over decades, and in doing so, it gave me back the one thing I thought I had lost forever: myself. I could be old. I could be physically frail. My hands might shake and my back might ache, but I was not confused. I was not paranoid, and I was not, under any circumstances, alone. The compass inside my head, the one Frankie's lies had sent spinning wildly, finally settled. It pointed true north again. It was time to fight. The next day, Mrs. Davis called me, the investigator. Her voice on the phone was different from the one I'd heard in my living room. It was still professional, but the neutral, assessing tone was gone, replaced by something warmer, more direct. She asked if I would be willing to meet with her again, this time alone, not at my house. Somewhere neutral, she suggested. How about the public library downtown in an hour? A neutral place, without Frankie. The request itself was a message. The seed of doubt my son had so skillfully planted in her mind had not taken root in the barren soil of his lies. It had withered and died, and something else, suspicion perhaps, was growing in its place. Hope, a feeling I was slowly reacquainting myself with, began to beat a steady rhythm in my chest. "Yes," I said, my voice clear. "I'll be there." The library was quiet, a sanctuary of ordered knowledge that smelled of old paper and wood polish. It felt like the right place for the truth to finally be heard. Mrs. Davis was waiting for me at a small table in a secluded corner, away from the main reading room. She gestured to the chair opposite her, and I sat down, my hands resting on my knees. "Mr. Roberts," she began, getting straight to the point. "Thank you for coming. After our meeting yesterday, I made some follow-up calls as part of my standard procedure. Specifically, I spoke with your in-home care nurse, a Ms. Sarah Jenkins." My heart, which had been beating steadily, gave a sharp kick. Sarah. I had almost forgotten that I was the one who had started this, that my desperate call had been the first domino to fall. "She provided us with her official case notes, Mr. Roberts," Mrs. Davis continued, her eyes holding mine. "A very detailed report of her observations over the last several months." She opened a slim folder on the table. It wasn't my ledger, but it felt just as powerful. "According to Nurse Jenkins's report," she said, her voice now a calm recitation of facts, "you have lost nearly 10 pounds in the last 3 months, a significant amount for a man of your build. She noted multiple unexplained bruises on your arms and forearms during your last 2 visits, bruises which she felt were inconsistent with your explanation of simply bumping into things." I stared at my hands, remembering the vague, shameful lies I'd told Sarah. I'd been so sure I was fooling her, but I hadn't been. She had seen right through me. "Furthermore," Mrs. Davis went on, flipping a page in her notes, "Nurse Jenkins documented a noticeable shift in your demeanor. She describes you as having gone from being open and talkative to withdrawn, fearful, and hyper-vigilant, especially when your son was present in the room. These are the observations of a trained medical professional, Mr. Roberts. In an investigation like this, they carry a great deal of weight." Each observation she listed was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Frankie's lies. I wasn't a paranoid old man imagining things. I was a patient whose symptoms had been professionally documented. And then there's one more thing, she said, her gaze intensifying. A detail that I found particularly concerning: the pharmacy records for your arthritis medication. Your prescription for painkillers is always refilled on the very first day it becomes available, and the supply is often depleted before the next refill date. Nurse Jenkins is of the professional opinion that the amount of medication you are actually consuming, based on your physical state, does not align with how quickly the prescription is being used up. This suggests the strong possibility that your medication is being taken by someone else. Mr. Roberts, do you know anything about this? That was it. That was the final piece. The one detail I hadn't even known myself, a quiet, insidious theft I hadn't even detected. Hearing all of it, my truth, my pain, my fear, validated by a calm, professional voice, something inside of me finally broke free. The shame that had kept me silent, the fear of not being believed, the terror. I placed them deliberately on the table between us. They made a soft, solid sound on the polished wood. "Mrs. Davis," I said, and my own voice surprised me with its strength. "This is what's really been happening." And I told her everything. This time there was no hesitation, no fear. I opened the floodgates. I showed her the photographs of the bank statements on a small laptop she produced from her bag. I pointed to the withdrawals, the transfers to gambling sites, the damning $5,000 deposit. I told her about George's call, about the irrefutable proof that Frankie had sold his grandfather's watches. And then, my voice dropping but losing none of its conviction, I told her about the shove, about the pain in my ribs, about the line that had been crossed. She listened, her expression unchanging, her focus absolute. She never once interrupted. She examined every photograph, her eyes missing nothing. She read every entry I had meticulously written in my ledger. When I was finally finished, the entire ugly story laid bare between us. She was silent for a long moment. Then she closed the folder, her movements precise and final. She looked at me and gave a single, decisive nod. "Thank you, Mr. Roberts," she said, and her voice held a new gravity. "Thank you for trusting me. Nurse Jenkins's testimony opened a door. This evidence you have provided has built a solid road through it. We now have everything we need to proceed with a full and formal investigation." Mrs. Davis was true to her word. The system, once activated, moved with an impersonal but undeniable momentum. 3 days after my meeting at the library, a letter arrived. It wasn't junk mail, and it wasn't a bill. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope delivered by a mail carrier who required a signature. Certified mail. The kind of mail that means business. Frankie was the one who signed for it. I watched from my armchair as he scrawled his name, his usual casual arrogance in the flick of his wrist. He tore it open, his expression one of mild annoyance, probably assuming it was some tedious bit of bureaucracy. I saw his eyes scan the first few lines of the heavy official-looking paper inside. And then I saw it. The thing I hadn't seen in him since he was a child who'd broken a window with a baseball, a flicker of pure, undiluted panic. His face, usually a mask of casual indifference, tightened. The color drained from his cheeks. He read the letter again, his lips moving silently. It was a formal request from the county's Adult Protective Services, inviting, or rather summoning, both of us to their downtown office for what they termed a mediation and assessment meeting. A date and time were set for the following week. It was not a request that could be ignored. The gears of a machine much larger than him were beginning to turn, and for the first time, I saw my son look truly afraid. That fear, however, did not last long. It quickly curdled into something else, something far more cruel. His panic morphed into a new and final weapon. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten me with lawyers or make physical threats. He did something far worse. He began to punish me with silence. From that moment on, I ceased to exist. He moved through the house as if I were a ghost, his eyes looking straight through me. I became an invisible object, a piece of furniture he had to navigate around. The first time it happened, I was sitting in the living room and asked if he could pass me the glass of water on the coffee table, just out of my reach. He heard me. I know he did. He was looking right at me. He simply turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door, leaving the glass sitting there. Later that day, as I tried to get up from my chair, my bad knee buckled. I reached a hand out to him as he passed. "Frankie, a little help." He met my gaze for a fraction of a second, his expression cold and flat, and then turned his head and kept walking. For 2 solid days, the house became a silent prison. The ticking of the clocks, once a comfort, now seemed to mock me, counting the seconds of my isolation. The silence was an active, oppressive force. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. This was his final, most insidious psychological assault. He was trying to break my will before the meeting. He was trying to make me feel so worthless, so utterly dependent on his slightest acknowledgement that I would crawl back to him. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to just give in, to tell him he was right, to sign the damn papers, anything to make it stop. But every time that wave of despair washed over me, I would close my eyes and see the evidence. The leather ledger in its secret drawer, George's furious, loyal voice roaring over the phone, Sarah's calm, professional gaze telling me she believed me, Mrs. Davis's decisive nod. I was not just fighting for myself anymore. I was a link in a chain of truth, and I could not be the one to break. Not now. On the evening of the second day, I decided I'd had enough. I was not his prisoner. Using the arm of my chair, I began the slow, arduous process of getting to my feet. Every joint screamed in protest. I planted my feet, my legs trembling with the effort. Then, using the wall for support, I began to shuffle my way toward the kitchen, one painful step at a time. I shuffled past the end table, then the sofa, then the doorway. Frankie stood in the kitchen entrance, watching me, his arms crossed. His face was a thundercloud of resentment. He didn't offer a hand. He just watched, expecting me to fail, to collapse, to give up and prove him right. I ignored him. I focused only on my goal, the sink. I reached it, my knuckles white as I gripped the cold edge of the counter. I opened the cupboard, took down a glass, and turned on the tap. I filled it to the brim and drank, the cool water a balm to my parched throat. It was the best glass of water I had ever tasted. It wasn't just water, it was independence. It was victory. I drank the whole thing, then calmly rinsed the glass and placed it in the rack. I turned and looked at my son. He was still standing there, but the look on his face had changed. He knew, in that moment, that his silent weapon had failed. He knew he had lost. That night, the night before the meeting, I didn't sleep. I sat in my workshop, my own sanctuary, and prepared my arsenal. I had printed the photos of the bank statements. I had printed the screenshot George had sent me of the online watch auction. I placed them in a neat file folder, each one in chronological order. I placed my leather ledger on top. Everything had to be perfect, logical, precise. I was a watchmaker, and this was the most important machine I'd ever assembled. Every piece of paper, every photograph, every handwritten note was a gear in the mechanism of justice I was building. The next morning, I dressed in my Sunday best, a crisp blue Oxford shirt, the one Martha had always loved, and a pair of gray slacks. I combed my hair carefully. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see a pitiful victim. I saw a man who had been wronged, a man who was now prepared to set things right. Frankie and I drove to the AP's office without exchanging a single word. But this silence was different. It wasn't a punishment anymore. It was the deep, profound stillness before an earthquake. The air in the car was thick with everything unsaid, with the knowledge that the world we had known was about to be shattered. We both knew, with absolute certainty, that after today, nothing would ever be the same again. The AP's office wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't a cold, sterile government building that smelled of disinfectant and bureaucracy. It was just a small, clean conference room, furnished with a simple round table and a few potted plants that were surprisingly green and healthy. Mrs. Davis was already there, seated at the table, along with another man in a collared shirt who looked to be a social worker. There were no police uniforms, no intimidating atmosphere. The air was professional, but undeniably serious. She invited us to sit, and Frankie and I took chairs opposite each other. The polished surface of the round table between us felt like a vast, empty canyon. I had never felt so far away from my own son. Mrs. Davis began by laying out the ground rules, her voice calm and measured. "The purpose of this meeting," she said, addressing the room but looking pointedly at Frankie, "is to clarify some concerns that have been raised regarding Mr. Roberts's welfare and his financial situation. Each of you will have an opportunity to present your perspective. We ask that everyone remain calm and treat each other with respect." When she said that last part, her gaze lingered on Frankie for just a second longer. It was a subtle but unmistakable shift. The power in this room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the process. It belonged to the truth. She didn't waste any time. "Frankie," she said, her tone even, "perhaps you could start by explaining these cash withdrawals for us. They total over $20,000 in the last 3 months. Frankie shifted in his chair. He tried to summon the same smooth, concerned persona he had performed for her in my living room, but something was off. Under the flat, neutral glare of the fluorescent office lights, his act seemed flimsy, transparent. "Like I told you," he began, trying to sound patient, "my father, he gets confused. He asks me to hold on to his money for him because he's afraid he'll spend it unwisely." The lie, which had sounded so plausible when spoken with confidence in our home, sounded weak and hollow here. Mrs. Davis listened without expression. She let the lie hang in the air for a moment, then she calmly turned the page in her folder. The next sheet was a printout. I recognized it immediately. It was the screenshot George had sent me. "I see," she said. "And what about this $5,000 deposit? The date it was credited to your father's account happens to match the exact date that 2 vintage Omega watches belonging to your father were sold on an online auction forum. The seller's username was Frankie R88. She slid the paper across the table towards him. "Is this your account, Frankie?" The color drained from my son's face. The mask of the dutiful son didn't just crack, it shattered. He stared at the printout as if it were a venomous snake. For a few seconds, he was completely silent. He was caught, utterly and completely caught. He started to stammer, his eyes darting between Mrs. Davis and me. I was trying to sell some of his old things to help pay his bills." "Which bills would those be?" Mrs. Davis asked, her voice still perfectly level, relentless in its calm precision. "Because according to our records, which we obtained with Mr. Roberts's permission, the utility company has issued a final disconnection notice for his electricity, and his cable service has already been shut off for non-payment." Every question was a hammer blow, systematically smashing his fabricated story into dust. He had no answer. He just sat there, deflating, the arrogant posture he always carried himself with collapsing in on itself. He looked smaller, weaker. I remained silent through it all, My own folder, my carefully prepared arsenal, sat untouched on the table in front of me. I realized I didn't need it. Not yet. The system was working. Mrs. Davis, with her quiet professionalism and her sharp, undeniable facts, was dismantling my son's web of deceit with the same methodical precision I would use to take apart a broken clock. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't accusatory. She was simply presenting the truth, one gear, one spring at a time. And with each piece she laid on the table, the ugly, rotten mechanism of his betrayal was exposed for everyone to see. Frankie was cornered. There were no more lies to tell, no more performances to give. There was nowhere left for him to run. The truth was being laid bare, not by my own tearful, emotional accusations, but by the cold, hard, and irrefutable language of numbers on a page. And in the sterile quiet of that room, they spoke louder than any shout ever could. Mrs. Davis concluded the initial meeting by informing us that the agency would need time to review the presented evidence. "We will be in contact within 48 hours with the next steps," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the social worker gathered his papers, Mrs. Davis asked Frankie to step outside for a moment, saying she needed a final private word with me. The look Frankie gave me as he walked out of that conference room was something I will never forget. It was a toxic cocktail of raw fury and, for the very first time, genuine, undisguised fear. He knew he had been outmaneuvered. He knew the walls were closing in. Once the door clicked shut, Mrs. Davis leaned forward slightly, her professional demeanor softening into one of quiet concern. "Mr. Roberts," she said, her voice low, "everything is proceeding as it should. You did the right thing, but I need you to understand that this is a volatile stage in the process. Your son is feeling cornered, and people who feel cornered can become unpredictable. Please be careful. If you feel unsafe for any reason at any time, I want you to call us immediately, day or night." Her warning, delivered with such gravity, was a sobering reminder that while the system, it was no longer a punishment. It was the tense, coiled silence of a predator waiting in the shadows. I sat in my lazy boy, the television screen dark and blank, listening to the ticking of the clocks. Around 10 o'clock, I heard Frankie's bedroom door open, but he didn't go to the kitchen or the bathroom. His footsteps came down the hall and stopped at the entrance to the living room. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there, a tall silhouette against the faint glow from the hallway. "Dad," he said. His voice was completely transformed. The arrogant swagger was gone. The casual indifference had vanished. All that remained was a raw, hollowed-out desperation. It was the voice of a man who knew he had lost. "We need to talk." I didn't answer. I just watched his shadow move into the room. He didn't take the sofa or another chair. In a gesture of complete submission, he slowly lowered himself to the floor and sat by the side of my armchair, looking up at me. He was making himself small, a child again. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible in the darkness. I messed up. I messed up bad. I got in over my head with debts. Things just spiraled. I never, ever meant to hurt you. You know I love you, right? You have to know that." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he played his final, most despicable card. Mom wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want to see her family torn apart like this in front of strangers." He was weaponizing my love for him. He was using the sacred memory of his mother as a shield for his own deceit. It was the last desperate gambit of a cornered manipulator. Can't you tell them it was all a misunderstanding?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please, Dad, you could tell them you let me sell the watches. You could say you gave me the money. We can just make this all go away." And there it was, the final test. He was asking me to destroy my own truth to save him from the consequences of his lies. He He was asking me to become a liar, just like him. 10 years ago, the father grieving his wife would have buckled under the weight of that plea. 1 year ago, the lonely broken man I had become would have hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the ghost of fatherly duty. But not now, not anymore. I looked down at the dark shape of my son, kneeling on the floor beside me. I saw him not as the predator he had become, but as the broken thing he was. But my pity could no longer be a currency he could spend. The bank was closed. "No, Frankie," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was as calm and steady as the ticking of my grandfather's clock on the wall. It was not a misunderstanding. And your mother would be ashamed to see how you've treated your father. The truth is the truth. A profound silence filled the room, heavier than any before it. His plea had failed. His manipulation had been rendered inert. He had no more weapons left in his arsenal. He had fired his last shot, and it had glanced off the armor of my newfound self-respect without leaving so much as a scratch. I had taken back my power. Not by shouting, not by threatening, not with evidence or authorities, but with a single, quiet word. A no. A word forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by the simple, unyielding weight of the truth. He stayed there for another long moment, shrouded in the darkness he had created. Then, without another word, he pushed himself to his feet and walked silently back to his room. In that moment, as I listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall, I knew that I had won. The legal battle, the meetings, the official proceedings, they would continue on their own course. But the real war, the war for my own soul, for my sanity and my dignity, that war was over. Mrs. Davis called me the next day. She informed me that she would be making one final home visit to conduct a concluding living environment assessment and to deliver the agency's official determination. She was polite but firm. Both Frankie and I were required to be present. I hung up the phone, and a slow, grim smile touched my lips. I knew this wasn't just a procedural visit. This was the final act. The stage was set. The confrontation wouldn't happen in a sterile, unfamiliar office. It was going to happen right here, in my own living room. On the very armchair where I had been shoved, in front of the silent, dark television screen where the whole nightmare had begun. There was a terrible, perfect symmetry to it all, a kind of poetic justice that only a watchmaker could truly appreciate. When the doorbell rang, it was the same feeling I used to get right before undertaking the most delicate part of a complex repair, the final steadying breath before placing a balance wheel that would decide if a priceless timepiece would live or die. The fear was gone. The trembling in my hands had ceased. All that was left was a quiet, unshakable focus. I invited Mrs. Davis in and offered her a seat on the sofa. Frankie, on the other hand, was a storm of nervous energy. He couldn't sit still. He paced back and forth behind the sofa, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting from Mrs. Davis to me and back again. The arrogance was a distant memory. He was an animal in a cage, and he knew the door was about to be locked. He knew the judgment was coming. Mrs. Davis didn't engage in small talk. She opened her file, and with the same methodical calm she displayed in her office, she began to lay out the case. She spoke of Nurse Sarah's official report, the weight loss, the unexplained bruises, my fearful demeanor in Frankie's presence. She spoke of the pharmacy records and the missing pain medication. She spoke of the bank statements, the relentless cash withdrawals, the transfers to online gambling sites. She spoke of the testimony of my friend George and the screenshots of the online auction, complete with the username FrankieR88. She laid each piece of evidence down like a card in a winning hand, creating an airtight, irrefutable picture of neglect, manipulation, and financial exploitation. Cornered, with every escape route sealed off by an impassable wall of facts, Frankie finally broke. But he didn't weep. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He exploded. The last vestiges of his composure shattered, and a raw, volcanic rage erupted from him. "All right, fine, yes, I took the money," he screamed, not at Mrs. Davis, but at me, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. Spittle flew from his lips. "That money should have been mine anyway, this whole damn house, all of it." And then, in his rage, blinded by a lifetime of resentment and entitlement, he confessed to the one thing I never knew, the rotten, festering core of his entire betrayal. "You owe me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with a furious, self-pitying whine. "You owe me the $40,000 you refused to invest in my company all those years ago. If you had just believed in me then, I wouldn't be in this mess. None of this would have happened. It's all your fault." The number hung in the air between us. $40,000, the exact amount of his credit card debt, the amount he felt I owed him, a debt he had decided to collect by any means necessary. That was the motive, not my supposed confusion, not his twisted version of filial protection, just greed, a bitter, selfish greed that had poisoned his soul. After his final desperate shout, a heavy silence descended upon the room. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the clocks on the wall, each one a small metallic heartbeat in the aftermath of the explosion. Mrs. Davis didn't react. She simply continued to write in her notebook, her expression unreadable. There was nothing left to say. The guilty party had just signed his own confession in his own blood and rage. I looked at my son. His face was flushed, his chest was heaving as he gasped for breath, and in that moment, I felt the last of my anger towards him simply dissolve. It was replaced by something I didn't expect, a deep, aching pity. Pity for this broken man, my son, who had allowed his own bitterness and failures to eat him alive, to corrode him to the point where he was willing to destroy his own father to feel whole. I sat there, steady and still, in my lazy boy. It was the same room. It was the same chair. It was the same two people. But the world had been turned upside down. The power dynamic had been irrevocably reversed. The man who had once whispered threats in my ear was now shouting his guilt to the heavens. The man who had been shoved into this chair like a disobedient child was now sitting on it like a king upon his throne, a silent, steady witness to the complete and utter collapse of his oppressor. Mrs. Davis slowly closed her notebook. The soft click echoed in the silent room. "Thank you both for your time," she said. "Roberts, this is Eleanor Davis." Her voice was the same as it had been in person, professional, measured, but I could hear a new warmth underneath the formality. A quiet note of satisfaction. "The agency has reviewed all the evidence, the reports, and the testimony from yesterday's meeting. A final determination has been made." I held my breath. Based on the irrefutable evidence of financial exploitation, emotional abuse, and the clear physical intimidation, and factoring in your son's own admission of guilt, the agency has issued an emergency protective order on your behalf, effective immediately. The words were so official, so clinical, but to my ears, they were the most beautiful arrangement of sounds I had ever heard. An emergency protective order, a shield, a wall. Mrs. Davis began to explain the terms, and with each sentence, I felt another one of the invisible chains that had bound me for so long simply rust away and fall to the floor. "First," she said, "Frankie is required to vacate the premises immediately. He is to leave your home." My house. It was my house again. "Second, a temporary restraining order is in effect. He is prohibited from coming within 100 yards of you, your home, or your vehicle. A zone of safety. A perimeter of peace. Third, we have already faxed the order to your bank. His name is being removed from all your accounts as we speak. He no longer has any access to your finances. My money, my life savings, they were mine again. Finally, all future communication, if any is necessary, must be facilitated through an APE's appointed case manager. He is not to contact you directly by phone, text, or any other means. The silence I had craved, the freedom from the constant underlying threat, was now guaranteed by law. When she finished, I couldn't speak for a moment. I just closed my eyes and let the feeling wash over me. It was a feeling lighter than air. It was the feeling of a prisoner, unjustly held for years, stepping out of his cell and feeling the sun on his face for the very first time. "Thank you," I whispered, the words inadequate, but all I had. "Thank you." An hour later, a police car pulled up to the curb. Not with sirens blaring, but quietly, discreetly. 2 officers, a man and a woman, got out and knocked on the door. I let them in, and they explained that their presence was simply to keep the peace and ensure the order was followed while Frankie removed his belongings. I didn't stay to watch. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the one I had shared with Martha, and stood by the window that overlooked the driveway. I watched as Frankie came out of the house, carrying duffel bags and cardboard boxes, his movements sullen and defeated. He threw them into the trunk of his car with a kind of resentful carelessness. There was no shouting, no final confrontation. It was all handled with a quiet, orderly, and impersonal efficiency. He was no longer my son, inflicting personal pain. He was just a subject complying with a legal directive. He filled his car, slammed the trunk shut, and got into the driver's seat. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. I waited for him to look up at the house, to look at my window. A final glance, a sign of remorse, anything. He never did. Without looking back, not even once, he started the car and drove away. I watched until his car disappeared at the end of the street. I didn't feel the triumphant satisfaction I thought I would. There was no joy in this victory. There was just a vast, hollow emptiness where a sun used to be. And then, slowly, seeping into that emptiness, came a feeling I hadn't truly felt in years. A deep, profound, and soul-cleansing peace. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my house was truly mine again. The silence was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a comfort, a blanket of serenity. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the back of the sofa, the cool wood of the dining table. I stopped in front of the wall of clocks. They were still there, my faithful, steadfast companions. Their gentle, rhythmic ticking was the sound of my life returning to its proper cadence. We had weathered the storm, they and I. We had endured. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived from the bank. Inside was the official paperwork confirming that Frankie's name had been scrubbed from my accounts. Mrs. Davis also sent a package with simple, clear instructions on how to set up automatic payments for my bills online and forms to reclaim full control. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once documented my own abuse, and spread the new papers out before me. I picked up my pen, Martha's pen, and began to fill them out. I wrote my name. I checked the box. I signed on the dotted lines. Each stroke of the pen wasn't an act of fear or coercion. It was an act of deliberate, conscious autonomy. I was reclaiming my life, one piece of paper at a time. The system had worked. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, had been served. I was safe. The darkest chapter of my life was finally, eventually, over. But as any reader knows, when one chapter ends, another must begin. The final page had been turned on the story of a victim. The question now, as I sat in the peaceful quiet of my own home, was what would I write on the first blank page of the rest of my life? The question I'd asked myself in the quiet of my kitchen, what would I write on the first blank page of the rest of my life, wasn't one that could be answered with words. The first sentences of that new chapter had to be written with actions. The very first thing I did the following Monday was call a locksmith. A young, polite man came over, and with a quiet efficiency, he He replaced every single lock in the house, the front door, the back door, even the old one on the basement storm door. When he was finished, he handed me a small, neat ring with 3 brand-new keys on it. They were shiny and cold in my palm, the sharp, clean edges a stark contrast to the worn-down keys I'd used for 40 years. I closed my hand around them, feeling the solid weight of the metal. This was more than just a security measure. This was a declaration. It was a statement, written in steel, that no one would ever again enter my home, my space, my life, without my explicit permission. The feeling was profound. It was the feeling of a fortress wall being raised, lock by solid lock. My next task was to reclaim my sanctuary. I went down to the basement, to my workshop. For months, it had been a place of refuge, but also a place of pain and ultimately of quiet rebellion. Now, it needed to be just a workshop again. I spent the entire day there. I didn't work on any clocks. I just cleaned. I took every tool out of its place, wiped it down with an oiled cloth until it shone, and put it back in its proper spot. I organized the tiny drawers filled with gears and screws and springs. I swept away the dust and the ghosts of the past months. The rhythmic, methodical work was a balm to my soul. Finally, I stood before the tall shelving unit, and I looked up at my loop, still sitting on that top shelf where Frankie had placed it as a cruel reminder of my physical limitations. It was a monument to my helplessness. I didn't sigh. I didn't curse him. I simply walked over to the corner, picked up the sturdy wooden step stool, and placed it firmly on the concrete floor. My knees protested, and my back ached as I climbed, but I did it, slowly, deliberately. I reached up, my fingers closing around the familiar cool metal of the watchmaker's loop. I held it for a moment, then climbed back down. I walked over to my workbench and placed it in its rightful, honored position, right next to my work light. In that simple act of retrieval, I felt a part of myself click back into place, a crucial gear in the mechanism of my own identity finding its teeth again. The next day, I reclaimed another piece of my freedom. I took my car keys, went out to the garage, and drove myself to the grocery store. It felt strange and wonderful to be behind the wheel alone, making my own decisions. I walked the aisles, not with a list dictated by necessity, but with the simple joy of choice. I picked out things I hadn't eaten in months, things Frankie had deemed too expensive or unnecessary. A thick, well-marbled ribeye steak, a bundle of fresh, crisp asparagus, a pint of my favorite coffee-flavored ice cream. Small, simple things, but they were my choices. Pushing the full shopping cart across the parking lot, the sun warm on my face, I felt a quiet, simple happiness I thought I had lost forever. It was the pure, unadulterated joy of providing for myself. That evening, I cooked that steak. I filled the house with the rich smell of searing meat and roasted vegetables. And as I ate, I did something I hadn't done since Martha passed away. I walked over to the old record player in the corner of the living room, a beautiful piece of furniture we'd bought together in the 70s. I flipped through the vinyl albums until I found it. Duke Ellington. I gently placed the record on the turntable, lowered the needle, and the warm, soulful sound of a trumpet filled the house. The music flowed into every corner, chasing out the lingering shadows of bitterness and fear. I didn't call to rehash the legal proceedings. Mrs. Davis had already kept him informed. I called just to talk. We talked about a rare Rolex that was coming up for auction. We argued about the Bears' chances this season. We complained about the weather. It was a perfectly normal, wonderfully mundane conversation between two old friends, but its significance was immense. It meant I was back. I was no longer a recluse, a victim held captive by circumstance. I was Harry again, Harry the friend, Harry the watch enthusiast, Harry the man. That night, before I went to bed, I found myself standing in the living room, looking at the wall by the grandfather clock. The two small, empty hooks were still there, a silent testament to what had been taken. For a moment, I felt a familiar pang of loss for the Omega watches my father had left me. But then another feeling, stronger and clearer, took its place. It was a new resolve. A legacy, I realized, isn't just about what is handed down to you. It's also about what you choose to build. Those hooks were a reminder of a legacy that was stolen, but they were also an empty space, waiting for something new. Perhaps, I thought, it was time for me to create a new legacy of my own. In the weeks that followed, a new, peaceful rhythm established itself in my life. I spent my days cleaning, organizing, and slowly reclaiming the quiet corners of my home that had been clouded by Frankie's presence. It was during one of these cleaning spells, while sorting through a box of old financial documents in my study, that I found it, my original last will and testament. It was the one I'd drafted with Martha years ago, the one Frankie had tried so desperately to have me change. My hands trembled slightly as I read through the familiar legal language. Most of it was straightforward: the house to Frankie, my tools to George, my personal effects distributed among distant relatives. But then I came to a clause I'd almost forgotten. A provision setting aside $50,000 to establish a scholarship fund at the local technical college where I'd first learned my trade. The Harry Roberts Scholarship for Excellence in Precision Mechanics. It was meant for a promising young student who, like me, had a passion for making things work. It was a good intention, a noble thought on a piece of paper. But as I sat there, in the silence of my reclaimed home, the idea felt hollow, impersonal. A check mailed to a school administrator, was that really a legacy? Or was it just another financial transaction, a final, soulless accounting of a life's work? The ordeal with Frankie had taught me a brutal, invaluable lesson. True value isn't found in numbers on a bank statement. It's found in human connection, in a skill passed from one hand to another, in the quiet guidance that helps a young person find their way. Frankie had looked at me and seen only a bank account to be drained. I couldn't bear the thought of my legacy being seen the same way, as just a name on a plaque, a check cashed and forgotten, a legacy of paper versus a legacy of people. The thought sparked something in my mind, an idea that felt more right, more me than anything I'd considered before. Instead of giving my money, why not give the one thing that was truly priceless? My time, my knowledge, my 60 years of experience held in these old arthritic hands. My heart began to beat a little faster. I picked up the phone and called George, my voice buzzing with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I laid out the idea for him. A few days later, he drove me over to the technical college. We didn't ask for the financial aid office. We asked to see the dean of the school. In his quiet, book-lined office, I made my proposal. I wasn't there to offer a scholarship. I was there to offer myself. I proposed starting a free, after-school extracurricular class. Harry's Horology Workshop, I called it. A place for students to learn the dying art of mechanical watch repair. The dean, a kind man with a warm smile, was surprisingly enthusiastic. The school, he explained, was always looking for ways to connect students with real-world skills and experienced mentors. They gave me a small, unused classroom in the vocational wing, a forgotten space filled with old desks and chairs. George and I spent the next week transforming it. We painted the walls a calm. I stood at the front of the room, my tools laid out neatly on the bench. Only 3 students showed up, 2 boys and a girl, all of them looking shy and uncertain. I didn't greet them with a lecture or a textbook. I reached into a box and pulled out a simple, old, non-working pocket watch. I placed it in the hands of the young woman. "Let's open it up," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "We'll find the story inside it together." Word must have gotten around. The next week, there were 7 students. The week after that, a dozen. Soon, my little classroom was filled to capacity with eager young minds. They weren't just learning about mainsprings and balance wheels. They were learning about patience, about the intense focus required to handle a screw the size of a grain of sand. They were learning the deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from fixing something that is broken instead of just throwing it away. I told them the stories of the watches we worked on. The soldier's watch that survived a war, the nurse's watch that had timed thousands of heartbeats, the pilot's watch that had crossed oceans. I saw their eyes light up with a familiar fire, the same passion that had ignited my own life 60 years ago. The air in the workshop, once silent and forgotten, was now filled with a new kind of music. The soft, precise clicks of tools, the low murmur of questions and explanations, the occasional triumphant laugh when a dead watch started ticking again. It was the sound of a legacy coming to life. Looking at the faces of these young people, bent over their workbenches with intense concentration, I realized something profound. I had spent so much of my later years worrying about the legacy I would leave behind when I was gone. I'd forgotten that the most valuable legacy is the one we give while we are still here to see it grow. My story, the one that started with a silent television screen and a bruise on my arm, has found its conclusion. Justice was served. The system, in its slow, methodical way, worked. But to say that everything went back to the way it was would be a lie. It didn't. Some things can't go back. There are scars that will never fully fade. The relationship between my son and me is broken, perhaps permanently. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house is still, I can still feel the ghost of that betrayal lingering in the corners of the room. Moving on is not the same as forgetting. Sometimes a car door will slam outside, and for a split second my heart will seize, thinking it's him. The quiet of the house is a blessing now, a silence earned, not a silence of fear. But the memory of that other silence, the one filled with unspoken threats and the weight of my own invisibility, still echoes here. The scars are on the inside, where no one can see them, but I know they're there. As a watchmaker, I spent my entire life thinking I understood time. I saw it as a linear progression, a reliable series of ticks and tocks, 1 second following the next, forever and ever, a straight, unbreakable line. But I was wrong. This journey has taught me that time is a much more complex mechanism. It's not a straight line. It can be bent into a circle by grief, making you relive the same moment of pain over and over. Its hands can be stopped dead by despair, freezing you in a state of helpless paralysis. But I've also learned that it can be repaired. It can be wound again by a single act of courage. Courage is the key that winds the mainspring, giving it the power to move forward. Honesty is the oil that lubricates the gears, allowing them to turn without grinding against each other. And purpose. Purpose is the balance wheel, the beating heart of the whole mechanism, regulating the pace and ensuring that every tick, every second, has meaning. This journey taught me that silence is not golden. For men of my generation, we were taught that strength was found in what you could endure without complaint. We learned to swallow our pain, but that kind of silence doesn't heal anything. It's a slow-acting poison. It's the medium in which darkness grows, where doubt and fear fester. In truth, my silence was just a permission slip for the abuse to continue. Breaking that silence was the most terrifying thing I've ever done. I remember the physical effort it took to lift that old phone to call for help, the way my throat closed up, the way my voice came out as a pathetic croak. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And it was the single act that saved my life. Never, ever underestimate the power of your own story. I was so afraid of losing but I understand now that a true inheritance isn't what you own. It's who you are. It's your self-respect. It's your dignity. It's the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. My true legacy isn't a number in an account. It's the calluses on my hands that tell the story of a 60-year career. It's the trust my friends have in my word. It's the ability to get back up after you've been knocked down, to look at your own broken pieces, and to have the patience to put them back together again, stronger than before. Those are the things no one can take from you, not unless you let them. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if Frankie will ever find true remorse, or if he'll just be sorry that he got caught. That's not for me to decide. The door to my forgiveness remains unlocked, but it is no longer unguarded and standing wide open. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not a gift you give to someone else to make them feel better. It's a boundary you set for yourself. It's deciding you will no longer allow their actions to poison your present. Whether he ever earns that forgiveness is his journey. My journey is to live the rest of my days in the peace that I have fought so hard to reclaim. You know, when we men who've seen more than half a century get together, the stories just seem to flow. Today, I've opened up my heart a little, and I'd be truly honored to hear a little of yours. Sometimes a simple click of a button, a like, a subscribe, or a share can seem like a small, fleeting gesture to many. But to me, and to other quiet voices that need to be heard, every single one of those clicks is like a signal flare in the dark. It's a quiet acknowledgement that says, I see you, I hear you, your story has value. Now that I've told you mine, what I want most is to listen to yours. In the comments section below, it would mean the world to me if you would share a piece of your own story. When was a time you felt dismissed or unheard? What is a passion of yours that others might have seen as foolish? Or what was a moment you found your own strength even in a small, quiet way? Please share if you feel comfortable. I will read them and I will carry them with me because your stories matter. What we want to build here at WAWA Ages is a community, a place where we men, fathers, grandfathers, husbands, and friends can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have a hardship to share today, then please share a small joy. What made you smile today? And if you're watching this on a television, please don't hesitate to pick up your phone and find my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's work together to make this a place where no man feels that his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me. It means more than you know.